thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I just want to start off by saying what an absolute pleasure it is to come and speak in the Pankhurst Centre. This is somewhere that I've come before, obviously somewhere that's very important to me, as I'm sure it is to everybody else here. But to be able to speak on the Pankhursts, in the Pankhurst Centre, on International Women's Day, on the 100th anniversary of some women getting the vote is very, very special indeed. And to speak in this venue and to think about the women who lived here and organised here, I think is to necessarily think about the different strategies that those women adopted and espoused in their struggle for women's rights. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about here tonight. And as well as different strategies for campaigning for women's rights, there have also been different approaches to this 100-year anniversary. One approach, which I am not going to adopt here tonight, but was the approach that Theresa May adopted on the anniversary. And she gave a couple of speeches on the 6th of February, where she talked about the legacy of the suffragettes in these terms. She talked about the fact that there are now some women in Parliament, the fact there are women at the tops of multinational companies, women at the top of the police force, and she described this as the legacy of the suffragettes, I think, with quite a misplaced smugness, really, because she didn't talk about low pay. She didn't talk about the experience of the vast majority of women in this country. She didn't talk about the services that have been cut as a result of austerity, of the government's austerity, that have disproportionately hit women, disproportionately driven women into poverty, disproportionately trapped women in potentially violent situations in the homes because of the cutting of the rape crisis centres, because of the cutting of public services on an absolutely huge scale. And I think that's what I want to start with, that I don't think this is an anniversary for complacency or for a sense of smugness. She also said this when she talked about it, the importance of 2018. She said, in an age where millions around the world are denied the right to vote, and millions here at home are apathetic about exercising it, it is only right that we all learn more about those who fought so hard to extend the franchise. And I think, again, this is a very problematic way of approaching this anniversary. It implies that there's something very superior about the British state, and that those that don't vote, and we know that that disproportionately is people who are poorer, who don't feel like they have a stake in society, who feel alienated from the political class for very, very obvious reasons, that that's just an apathetic personal choice that they've made, and they just need to learn a little bit more about this history. But it's that sense of the British state as superior to others around the world that I want to start off with and take on. Because I think the question of what the state is very important and ought to underpin any kind of attempt to answer this question about why, how and in what form women, some women, won the right to vote in 1918. And to think about the state and what it is, I think one of the important starting points here, one of the very useful quotes about this, is a quote from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, just before the two of these revolutionaries fought very, very hard for democratic rights in what would become Germany. And they described the state as a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So what do they mean by this? What they meant by this was that the state is not something neutral, but is an instrument to maintain the dominance of the dominant class in society. That is what's used by them to maintain their power and their privileges, and that therefore the state itself is fundamentally undemocratic in what it intends to do. It intends to keep the status quo and the dominance of the privileged in society. Now, if that's a useful description of any state, I think we need to take a step back and think about how particularly that applies to the British state, and particularly in the period that we are talking about, the Edwardian era. The British state most of the British state is fundamentally undemocratic. It is a democracy-free zone, if you like. We are allowed to elect representatives now to the House of Commons, and that obviously has been a very, very long struggle to achieve that. The House of Lords is obviously completely unelected, so also is the judiciary, the police, the armed forces, and so on and so forth, the monarchy. But the British state in the Edwardian period presided over the largest empire in the world at that time. So the existence and the power and the privilege of that state rested and relied upon the subjugation and denial of political rights to millions of people all around the globe. And I think we therefore very much have to bear that fact in mind when we think about what the British state was and why it resisted so fiercely every campaign for political rights and reform, because to give greater political rights endangered the state and indeed the empire. And to talk about this here in Manchester, I think is probably quite an obvious thing to do. The kind of the struggles that took place in this city from 1819 and Peterloo, the massacre of working people who were demonstrating for political rights. When you think about the Chartist movement, which obviously Manchester was one of the centres of the Chartist movement, the kind of persecution that Chartists faced. Chartists were shot dead for advocating for political rights for working class people. They were transported to Australia and imprisoned. We think about the Tolpuddle martyrs, those that fought for trade union rights. This, and then indeed to think later on about the incredible violence that was meted out to the militant suffragettes. This was a state that has absolutely resisted or attempted to resist very, very violently indeed any attempts to demand even a small bit of democratic accountability in the state. But I think, as well as doing that, the state very often wants to deny the reality of all of those struggles, and it seeks to obscure the way in which reform happens in this country. So we talk about, when we're in school, when we do history, you learn about the Reform Acts, and it's always presented as something that Parliament has achieved on our behalf. This is something that gets passed through Parliament, and we should be grateful for getting those political rights. In a more extreme version of this, I wish to quote Lloyd George, the Prime Minister in 1917, in the House of Commons, explaining why he supported votes for women. Although he'd been part of a Liberal government that had resisted, and he'd played a very important part in that Liberal government, being the Chancellor of the Exchequer, at a time when women were being imprisoned and persecuted for fighting for their rights. He declared in the House of Commons in 1917 that he'd always been in favour of votes for women, which must have been a shock to some people. But he said now is a particularly good moment to grant women a vote because of this. And this is what he said. It would have been impossible to produce that overwhelming mass of ammunition we had at the Somme had it not been for the work of these women. And they have shown a devotion and zeal, and may I say a courage, which are beyond challenge. So there is Lloyd George saying, the women produced all of that ammunition that allowed us to conduct the Battle of the Somme. This is speaking in 1917, the year after the Battle of the Somme. The year after this incredible level of violence. From somebody who was offended by women smashing a few windows. Let's just remember that. But this is somebody who's absolutely saying, oh no, it was the devotion of women in the munitions factories, i.e. nothing to do with the suffragette struggle. And in a similar way, I think, when we think about the struggle today and Theresa May's response, although she mentions and tries to claim the suffragette legacy, I think a part of what her speeches were doing was saying, those struggles are in the past. They've happened and they're not relevant to now. And if people aren't interested in voting now, or if people feel disaffected or angry now, that's their own fault. So the state attempts, I think, all the time to deny how effective it is when we struggle and when we organise together to change things for very obvious reasons. But because it does that, I think it can give the impression sometimes that the state is sort of above society or is neutral and not really a product of the kind of society in which we live. And this is important because in the period that we are looking at, particularly the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century, there's a very important debate about what the nature of the state is. And on the one hand, there are those that are very much kind of taking the analysis that Karl Marx was putting in the Communist Manifesto, and later much more detail in response to the Paris Commune in 1871, when working class people seized control of the city in a revolutionary moment. When Marx wrote that it wasn't just enough for working class people to occupy positions in the state, but there had to be a revolutionary transformation of it in order for it to work in the interests of the vast majority. People like Rosa Luxemburg, for example, an outstanding revolutionary in Germany, who argued that the approach of campaigners, that campaigners had to have in mind that there needed to be a revolutionary transformation of society, and within that must work for reforms and fight intensely for every single reform, but with the idea that society has to be fundamentally transformed, that power has to be taken away from the powerful. So this is what some people were arguing. On the other hand, you had those that argued that the state could be transformed from within, completely and fundamentally, that if the right people got into parliament, that everything could be changed, and that a kind of revolutionary transformation was not necessary. And this debate becomes important, and the implications of it, I think, are very sharply seen with the outbreak of the First World War. Because with the outbreak of the First World War, many campaigners who had argued that the state could be transformed from within, really demonstrated their belief also that their own state was superior to other states around Europe that they were now at war with. And they all found a progressive reason for this. Germany talked about perfidious Albion with its huge empire and being allied with Tsarist Russia, whereas Britain talked about militaristic Germany. They all found something that sounded vaguely progressive. And those that argued that there needs to be a fundamental revolutionary transformation of the state, combined with some of those whose moral objection to the First World War was far more profound than any attachment that they had to their nation states, those were the ones who opposed the First World War. And they were very much, at the beginning in 1914, when the First World War broke out, they were very much in the minority. So you get the leadership of the Labour Party in Britain, you get the leadership of the kind of the equivalent in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, all throwing their weight behind their national state. And this same process, this same argument takes place within the women's suffrage movement. And very often when we talk about the suffrage movement, a lot in the media, we'll talk about the debate between the suffragettes and the suffragists. But in fact, this debate hits both of these kind of sections in very similar ways, and we can overlook, I think, some of the similarities between these campaigns, despite their difference of tactics. The suffragists, led by Millicent Fawcett, when war broke out, Millicent Fawcett, much to the disapproval of many of her members, but she was absolutely a supporter of the British Empire. And although many of her members left and joined pacifist organisations, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies supported the British government in the First World War. And this wasn't because they thought they could get the vote by doing this. Millicent Fawcett said on the outbreak of war, "Let us show ourselves worthy of citizenship, whether our claim to it be recognised or not." So this is her saying that the preservation of the British state and the British Empire is more important at this moment than campaigning for votes for women. And a similar thing happens with the main militant suffrage organisation, led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. It started off as a very radical organisation. It's the Women's Social and Political Union. It was founded here in radical Manchester by the Pankhurst family at a time when they were involved in the Independent Labour Party, when they invited radical women from across Lancashire to be part of this, women who were involved in the textile movement, in the trade unions. Women like Annie Kenny, who came to this house to meet and organise with the Pankhurst, women like Teresa Billington-Grieg, who was involved in the Equal Pay League, women like Hannah Mitchell, a local working class woman, very, very radical origins. But in the face of the government's intransigence and refusal to grant votes for women, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst began to look to increasingly undemocratic forces and reactionary forces in society to try and win the vote, at least for some women, which we know would have been a more elite section. There were more appeals, for example, to the King. We know that Christabel Pankhurst was appealing to the Conservative Party and the Ulster Unionists as well. When the war breaks out, they explicitly say and call upon their supporters to work in the munitions industry, to support the war effort. I was going to say support the government, but actually they went even further. They even accused some members of the government of being pro-German. So, I mean, this is kind of how out of hand this situation got. But this wasn't the approach that everybody took. Their own members in these organisations were often quite dissatisfied with the positions taken by the leadership. But in the run-up to the First World War, there was a very important break from the organisation that Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst ran, and that came from the second Pankhurst daughter, who lived here in her adolescence, Sylvia Pankhurst. And she was expelled from the Women's Social and Political Union for creating a working class women's movement in the East End of London. And it was a working class women's movement that, instead of appealing, as her mother and sister were increasingly doing, to undemocratic and reactionary forces in society and sections of elite women, was actually trying to link up with the mass progressive movements at the time. In particular, from 1910 to 1914, throughout Britain there is what breaks out is what's called the Great Unrest, which is a huge wave of strikes in factories, in huge industries across Britain, where working people, particularly those who've been written off, who've been derided as unorganisable, unable to stand up for themselves, marched out on strike, demanded better conditions, created trade unions, joined them in huge numbers, and won considerable gains. And this was the kind of movement that Sylvia Pankhurst linked up with, and in particular the sort of spark for her expulsion was her standing on a platform in solidarity with trade unionists who'd been locked out of work, effectively being starved back into work in Dublin, in Ireland. And I think for Sylvia Pankhurst, she very much saw that these struggles had a lot in common and a lot of strength that they could give to each other. And she saw that it was the same government that sent troops out to shoot at people that dared to go on strike, was the same government that was imprisoning suffragettes, was force-feeding the suffragettes in the prisons, was sending out the police to batten suffragette demonstrations. But also she saw that they both had an interest in combining together to fight for a much more democratic society, whether that be rights at work or indeed freedom in Ireland. And I think it's no coincidence that when the First World War breaks out, Sylvia Pankhurst is actually in Ireland reporting on troops firing on children. But at this point, the organisation in East London, I might take a few more minutes, if that's all right. And those that opposed the war were not really strong enough to turn the tides. These alliances that were being made, had there been a few more months, who knows what would have happened? Who knows if there would have been substantial and organised resistance to war? Instead, they weren't really able to turn the tide and to resist the government. And it was the bigger organisations that dominated. But even so, it's important to remember that those around Sylvia Pankhurst were raising arguments about why this war was not something that they should support. And I want to quote Melvina Walker, who was a docker's wife. Her husband had been on strike in 1912. She was a doctor's wife, lived in East London. And she wrote this days after war breaking out, after there had been attacks on German people in East London. She said, "How strange. British transport workers, trade union men, are called upon to shoot down German transport workers. And it's not so very long ago, in the time of our industrial war, I mean the Great Dock Strike, 1912, when we were fighting the large ship owners, we received with joy the news that these same men had sent us £5,000 to help us in our fight for better conditions. We said we would never forget their kindness. Let us keep our word by treating all those German workers who are left behind in our midst with civility." So what Melvina Walker is saying is that actually that act of solidarity proved that German workers and British workers had far more in common with each other than they did with their states that were sending them to war and to fight with each other. So the outbreak of war, we've got to reject, I think, Lloyd George's explanation for how women got the vote, this was just their loyalty and they proved they could make wonderful munitions for the Somme. The outbreak of war prevented progressive struggles from progressing. It hindered them, it restricted them, and in fact they stopped organising. The outbreak of war was a fundamental attack on democracy. In so many ways, the election that should have been held in 1914 or 1915 was postponed to the end of the war because democracy was not as important as Britain winning the war. That was literally the calculation that was made. The Labour movement gave up, the leaders of the Labour movement gave up the right to strike. The Defence of the Realm Acts restricted freedom of expression. And in 1916, conscription was introduced. So the immediate effect of the war was not to create democracy, but was to clamp down upon democracy. But there's another side to this. And this is where the war argument holds some truth, but only a partial truth. And I think we need to talk about what that is. That at the same time as it was this clamp down on democracy, the war demanded that society be fundamentally changed to prosecute the war. They needed women to go and work in munitions factories urgently. It was a time when the suffrage movement could have held the government to ransom, but no, they needed women to work in these factories to produce the munitions, and women seized this opportunity to change their lives. They seized the opportunity to get out of miserable domestic service, whether it would have been mostly one or two of them in some house serving lady and lord so-and-so or whatever. Very atomising and depressing, demoralising work where you have to live in your employer's house, where you get maybe one afternoon off a week. They seized this opportunity to get out of there and work in a munitions factory where they were better paid, where they had free time, where they could go out after work. Change. But also, as the war goes on, people involved in these progressive movements who've given up their campaigns, who've been told they had to give up the right to strike and all of these things, saw that this sacrifice, this giving up of particular interests, was not being done at the top of society. In fact, the very opposite. There was profiteering going on in a huge level during the First World War. Rents skyrocketed. Prices skyrocketed in this period of the First World War because for those landlords, they wanted to make a profit out of this situation. It was very important that their profit margins were preserved. And really the resistance to the prosecution of the war and the way things are going and the unequal levels of sacrifice, the first kind of resistances to that comes from women. So in 1915, there's a rent strike in Glasgow, where women, organised by a woman called Mrs. Barber, who became Mrs. Barber's Army, stopped a woman who all of the male members of her family were fighting at the front. She was going to be evicted because she couldn't afford the rent that had gone up. Mrs. Barber's Army organised a defence campaign for every woman that they threatened to evict, and all of these women in the community would come round, they'd hide out at night with bags of flour, and as soon as the bailiffs turned up, they'd call each other, they'd throw the flour over the bailiffs, they'd stop these people being evicted. And they got the ship workers to come out on strike in support. And really you see it in this period from 1915 onwards. All of this, working people must sacrifice everything and give up any right to protest about any injustice, all starts to break down on a very, very significant level. There are strikes in the coal mines, there are strikes, and these are, by then illegal strikes, there are strikes in the engineering industry. One of my sort of favourite quotes about this is about striking women munition workers in Newcastle who were told to go back to work for the sake of the soldiers. And apparently, when they were told this, a girl waved her hand and said, "Don't mention the soldiers. England at 2.5 pence an hour isn't worth fighting for." At the same time, you also get in Easter 1916 an uprising in Dublin against British rule. Which newspaper potentially breaks the laws, sneaks into Dublin to give a true report of this to get round the Defence of the Realm Act? It's Sylvia Pankhurst newspaper from East London. She sends a reporter, a young Irish woman, to sneak back into Dublin to report about what the imposition of the British Empire was really like. And in the interviews that this woman did, she asked an old woman what she felt about what had just happened, the crushing of this uprising against British rule. And this woman said, "The English don't hate the Germans the way they hate us." And I think you get this sense from this woman in Newcastle, but from quotes like that, you get this sense that people are really drawing a conclusion in the First World War, that the enemy of the ruling elites in Britain, for the ruling elites in Britain, is their own colonial subjects and their own working class. And that any attempt by those people to claim any rights will be very, very brutally faced indeed. So you get this change in atmosphere and the upheavals that have been caused by the war. Working class people actually start to see how strong potentially they are and how they could bring an end to the war. To come back to Melvina Walker, she was arrested in Hyde Park for apparently saying this, Melvina Walker, who extended her solidarity to German people. By February 1917, this is what she was saying, that our class in Germany was just as good as we are. What we want is peace. It is up to us workers to end the war. And I think, by 1917, you get this sense all the way across Europe that working people have lost any faith in their governments to end these wars. So it was just a bloody war of attrition on the Western Front. And people start to realise that if this war's going to be stopped, they're going to have to stop trusting the politicians, that they're going to have to put a stop to it themselves. And this starts, most dramatically, most decisively with the Russian Revolution in 1917. But then, in different armed forces, in the German armed forces, in the French armed forces, in the British armed forces, there are strikes and mutinies all the way across those services. And this is the atmosphere in which women's suffrage is now debated at the end of the First World War. I won't end very soon, but I want to just give two quotes about this and about what really was felt to be at stake here. I think really what we see when you read the debate about whether women should, or some women should be given the right to vote, you can sense the kind of fear in Parliament. This is Mr. Arnold Ward, who was the Conservative MP for Watford, who was still arguing that women shouldn't have the right to vote because they didn't even fight in war. That's literally what he said. He also said, "Is it wise to place upon the register a mass of necessarily inexperienced voters, liable to be swayed by the arguments of hysterical agitators and consequently liable to use the vote to the detriment of our soldiers and sailors?" So you can see here, this MP for Watford is terrified that in this atmosphere, women are going to be radical voters and going to vote for change. But the argument is swayed by Herbert Asquith. He was the Prime Minister at the height of the suffragette movement. He was vociferously anti-women's suffrage. And he says he's changed his mind. Why did Asquith say he changed his mind? He said it was important. He said there was a need of finding a solution for issues fraught with the possibility of engendering grave domestic friction and internal friction. So this is the calculation. These people are afraid that the discontent they have stirred up through their prosecution of the war is going to create fundamental change in Britain, that their power and their privilege is under threat, because by the end of the First World War, those forces that have been organising for democratic change before the First World War, in Ireland, in the trade union movement, in the labour movement and in the women's suffrage movement, have now come back in different formations, certainly, but very, very angry, organised, and in the case of the soldiers, armed as well. And there is a sense, there's a palpable sense of fear, I think, on the part of the British government about what are they going to do to stop this change going too far. And the calculation is they will give the vote to some women, not all women. It'll be women over the age of 30, and this explicitly excludes most of those women who would have made the ammunition that went to the Somme. You know, it exposes absolutely the dishonesty of what Lloyd George was saying. It would have excluded the younger women, because the younger women in the factories were the ones that were seen as being most susceptible to radical ideas, to, you know, those radical, hysterical agitators that so worried Arnold Ward. So I think that's the context in which we have to see this partial reform. The suffrage movement wasn't strong enough to make it, you know, by the end of the First World War, because they'd given up so much of their power. They weren't strong enough to make it on the same terms as men. But the fact that that was granted, and the way in which that was granted, I think we have to reject the idea it was because of loyalty in the war. It was a bribe for loyalty after it, in fact. It wasn't because people, and it wasn't because women obeyed, it was because of those women who disobeyed. And it wasn't just a sort of overcoming of prejudice, it was actually making these people afraid because of how people were organising collectively together. And when we think about the kind of challenges that we have today, about the things that, you know, maybe were partially ignored on the 6th of February, when we think about low pay, when we think about domestic violence, when we think about the cutting of our services, when we think about sexual exploitation that is endemic, and as we see from, you know, exposures at that President's Ball, have now become a part of work. When we think about all of the things that we want to change in our lives today, I think that lesson that it's radical change, that it's organising together, that it's disobeying, that achieves change is more important than ever.
Thank you for that very passionate talk. It was wonderful. So what we're going to do now is we're just open it up really to comments or any questions for Kate. It'd be good if anyone's got a question, put the hand up, and then if there's quite a few people, we'll maybe take questions and comments first and then come back. Yeah. Okay. So has anybody got any comments or questions that would like to do?
This is about Galsworth. Do you know about that entire issue? Do you want to talk about kind of how you see changing that? I mean, already this demonstration is actually happening today. Yeah. There's going to be another one next week. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, you may well know more about this than me, so please come back if I haven't sort of covered it. But I mean, sorry, should we take a few? I just sort of launched in there.
Anybody that's got any more questions or comments for now?
Because other people might want to
comment. We just want to be there to see if there's anything. So, okay, sorry.
My question is just around the links between the women's suffrage movement and men's movements. So I know about that. And the other question is about so obviously they were the votes extended to some women over the age of 13, blah blah blah. So was that something that a lot of women fought for, or did they generally campaign like for working class?
Sure. Votes. Any other comments or questions? We can come back and
just a comment. I was quite interested in what you said about the working class women sort of defending other women and families from being evicted, and I missed sort of who you said that was, or it's a story that my gran told to me, so first hand about chasing landlords down the road, and not just her, but with broomsticks or brooms. Wow. That when they came to try and evict people who, I mean, this is working class people. It would have been in Manchester by then, I think, as well. I know she flitted a lot. Various kind of like, my mum said to me about her and the sister sharing a bike for Christmas, and the people who she bought the bike off came and collected it the next day. So it's kind of that kind of poverty you're talking about. But that was a collective thing that people used to do, so I was quite interested in that. I didn't know there was any kind of recorded information about that, because I've just got that first hand from my grandmother.
If there's no other ones now, we can always come back as well. So do maybe
Sorry about just jumping in there. Trying to spoken enough. On weekend, I mean, what's happening at Yarmswood is disgusting. I mean, and yeah, please, if you know, I don't know a huge amount about what's going on there, but it's obviously it's a big detention centre. Obviously, like, women and children shouldn't be locked up into, no one should be locked up in detention centres. But, you know, especially not people who are very, very often going to be fleeing, you know, horrendously violent situations, are going to be, you know, people who are traumatised and then are further traumatised by this experience. And we know that we've known for years that the conditions in these detention centres are disgusting. They're run by private companies. They're completely unaccountable, and people are treated appallingly in there, and we know this. And very, very bravely, it seems, that some of the women imprisoned in there have gone on hunger strike. And it seems that the response to this has been to issue them with letters to say that if they do that, then they'll be sent back home quicker, or wherever, quicker. Which, I mean, it's just disgusting. It sums up so much about the kind of brutality of the way that refugees are treated in this country. And I mean, it's illegal as far as I can see. You know, sending people away from Britain is not supposed to be done on a kind of punitive level. It's supposed, you know, I mean, it really is absolutely vile. So yeah, I would say definitely join the protests, and this is something we should make a lot of noise about.
There's been a call for a solidarity and hunger strike today.
Oh yes,
yeah.
I mean, anything that people can do to raise awareness about it, I think is really, really important. So women and the men's movements. I mean, there was a very difficult relationship a lot of the time. There was a lot of sexism, obviously, and there were particularly in the labour movement and the socialist movement, there were men who were very supportive of women's rights and who were committed to that, and were committed socialists, and they understood that fighting for women's liberation was a part of that. And then there were those that didn't understand that at all. So this was a battle that had to be fought, and so there was different relationships with different individuals and different leaders, and certainly Sylvia Pankhurst really believed that these divisions, if they were there, could be overcome through organising together, which I think really is the only way that we change people's ideas. It is by showing solidarity, it is by organising together, by showing that together we're stronger. And certainly the kind of progress that she was making and the links that she was making, I think, were incredibly important. But women were excluded from some trade unions. There were all of these kinds of problems. But actually, with the great unrest, with the fact that so many women took part in that, did mean that some of those barriers got knocked down. But then, at the same time as the suffrage movement became more elitist, obviously there's some very important exceptions, that again made that difficult then to make alliances with labour and socialist male movements, movements which largely included men, and made alliances with men in kind of much more elite organisations. This question about what they were actually campaigning for, and this is always a tricky one because the vote was granted on a property basis in this country, so you have to have enough property, state deemed, but basically the calculation was, if you had enough property, then you wouldn't vote for things to change too much, because if everybody, this goes back to the debates in the English Revolution, the Putney debates. This is exactly the debate they have in 1647. It is if you give what that Henry Ireton says at the debate, Cromwell's son-in-law, if you give the vote to everybody, most people don't have any property, they don't have a stake in the way that things are, so they'll just get rid of private property. So he said, we can't do that, it's a disaster. So he says there's got to be like a threshold. And this is the way that then the vote gets granted. You have to have a certain amount of property to not want stuff to change. Again, going back to how fundamentally undemocratic all the understanding of this was. So this produces a dilemma, because then do women campaigners campaign for everybody to have the votes, which is where Sylvia Pankhurst ends up, campaigning for human suffrage. One person, one vote, but then more elitist suffrage campaigns didn't want that, and they wanted just formal equality. So the main slogan of the campaign was on the same terms as it is or may be granted to men. That was the main slogan. So they didn't get that. They didn't get that in 1918 because it was on different terms. And 30 wasn't. In the House of Commons they were debating if 30 was enough. Like there were some people who were like 35. This is literally the conversation they were having. And yeah, certainly the Glasgow rent strikes. I mean, they're not the only ones. They're probably the most famous. Are well documented. There's a Mary Barber of Govan, but there were other women as well. I've forgotten their names, and she's the most famous. But yeah, certainly, Willie Gallagher writes about her quite a lot in his autobiography, Revolt on the Clyde, and so these were known women. They were community leaders, and and it sounds exactly like the kind of stories that you were saying.
It could have been Liverpool with that one.
Right.
She came to Liverpool. Which I think was probably more militant than Manchester at the time.
Right.
Even though you've got sort of 1819, you've got the Peterloo, but I think Liverpool might have been, but yes, could be Manchester as well. Because she came to Manchester after that.
Wow.
But I'm really quite pleased to hear that. I didn't know about the sort of Glasgow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I think it happened in quite a lot of places as well. I mean, Sylvia Pankhurst was trying to get some to break out in East London. And they changed the law. They forced them to change the law over this to stop the profiteering and all else.
Okay, so I don't know, is there any more questions? Does that answer your question, or is there anything to add to that?
I was just wondering, because men were fighting for more rights, weren't they, to get the vote for working class men?
Well, not very much, really. I mean, there was sort of other things that, there was a campaign for adult suffrage, so for everybody, but it wasn't particularly lively, and it involved women as well. But there wasn't really, I would say, like a sort of men's movement to enfranchise all the rest of the men. Not really, not. I guess, there were sort of, there were campaigns over poor treatment of work and all of those sorts of things, but the sort of after the 1884 Act, there wasn't like a big, nothing like the Suffragettes.
What did the 1884 Act give to the men?
So
what did the 1884 Act give?
So that enfranchised sort of poorer men who were living in kind of agricultural countryside districts. But then in 1910, what the government did is they actually introduced a bill to enfranchise another section of poorer men. So they kind of changed again the property qualification. And this was a complete shock to the women who were like, well, where's that? We've just been campaigning, and you've introduced another male suffrage bill. And the government said, well, you can introduce an amendment, and of course they voted the amendment down. But yeah, that was a shock to everybody, because they were like, but it's not really it wasn't men and women, it was...
What was the equivalent now? What would the equivalent be today? I've heard it was said it was the property requirement was £5, a minimum of £5. So what would the equivalent of that be?
Oh Oh God, and I'm actually terrible with numbers, so I'm really sorry. It did, it excluded about, I can't say in terms of actual numbers, but in terms of how many women over 30 were excluded, I believe it excluded about 22% of women who might have been part of it.
I mean, I can go back to sort of the 1960s probably, and my sister bought her first house for just over £1,000, I think. So you're talking, 50 odd years before that. So kind of equivalent, really. I'm just trying to.
It'd be something that would encompass, and obviously like house prices have gone crazy, but it would be something that would encompass most women, but by not all, and 22% is a lot to be excluded. Or all married to somebody.
Yeah, I've got a couple of people. Yeah, so
Could you tell us a bit more about the Pankhurst Centre in there?
yeah. And then do you want to take your question then?
Oh, more of a comment really than a question about where the women's movement is in the 21st century. The last 12, 18 months has been a lot of Trump coming to the fore and with the sexism in his campaign, his past life, the Me Too campaign with the 99, the President's Club incidents, and BBC equal pay incidents, but the equal pay was across the whole society. Is there a sort of burgeoning women's movement coming to the fore somewhere, which I've not seen anywhere myself? I know a lot of people are campaigning, but is there a particular, like a suffragette movement coming anywhere?
Is it a fifth wave?
Yeah.
I've got another question. How broad, was the movement in general? How often, people meet in, and how big were meetings, and what activity was there? Just generally the level of activity and the numbers involved.
Okay. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk more about the Pankhursts. They were an incredible, amazing family. Both Emmeline Pankhurst, born Emmeline Goulden, and Richard Pankhurst came from her husband, came from radical families. Emmeline in particular, her grandfather had been a Peterloo, which she was very, very proud of. And he'd been involved then in the Anti-Corn Law League with his wife. Her parents were very involved in kind of supporting the anti-slavery movement in the United States, and that was something that resonated very, very much in Lancashire, and I'm sure lots of people here know. But in Lancashire, where obviously a lot of the cotton that was being imported, that had been grown by people that were enslaved, the cotton workers supported the North in the Civil War, which was out of solidarity at a time when the Prime Minister kind of wanted Britain to intervene on the part of the South. It was an incredible gesture of solidarity. So her parents, although they weren't themselves factory workers, her grandfather had been quite poor, but her own parents were sort of middle class members of Manchester society. They were also involved in that kind of solidarity movement. And Dr. Richard Pankhurst, who was a radical barrister, came from a kind of a non-conformist background, and later himself became sort of renounced religion and was a liberal. But both of them, so both he and his wife, they had a very political relationship. They were united by politics, and you very much get the sense that Dr. Pankhurst, who espoused all sorts of progressive causes, the abolition of the House of Lords, still not achieved, votes for women, home rule for Ireland. This was somebody who obviously regarded his wife as a political being, and she was active not just in campaigns supporting him when he ran unsuccessfully for Parliament 3 times, But also she became a member of the Board of Guardians in Manchester, was herself on the National Executive of the Independent Labour Party. So both of them were political actors. And then, so they later became very disillusioned with the kind of compromises of the Liberal Party and become attracted to the early socialist movement. And this is the environment in which they bring up their children. So they had 3 daughters and 2 sons. One son died very young, and the other, Harry Pankhurst, died when he was about 20 years old. And he'd been involved in the suffragette movement. The daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, it's a bit of a shame that Adela doesn't make the plaque outside, but the 3 daughters again were treated as political sentient beings by their father. He was apparently always asking them what they were going to be when they grew up. And at a time when for a middle class young lady the expectation would have been like, who are you going to marry? And he would let them read whichever books they wanted to read. He would always bring those back. There was no censorship, and they were allowed to just sort of mingle at their. Mother didn't send them to school for ages, so they were just allowed to mingle with all of their parents' friends, who were communards and free thinkers, and all these kind of amazing radicals. So they were amazing people. Dr. Pankhurst died in 1898, and that's why they moved here. They had lived in a much larger house, and then because obviously the death of the main breadwinner in the household meant they had to move to a smaller place. And it's after he dies that they found the Women's Social and Political Union. But they've been involved in women's suffrage for a very long time by then. And it's then you get this kind of big political divergences opening up between different members of the family. But yeah, I'll be happy to talk afterwards way more about Pankhurst. I completely agree about the fact that there's such a need for a women's movement, obviously. And I think we're now kind of confronting this question of okay, what is it that we've won formal equality? That means the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1970. Well, why have we not got equal pay? All these companies are terrified of releasing the audits in April because they're going to look terrible because we don't have equal pay. And all of these other kinds of issues. It can be formally on the statutes, and yet there isn't equality, and we know. So I think we're coming up against the kind of the limitations of that, and we're coming up against the limitations of the kind of democracy in which we live, when we don't have power over economic questions. I think that's extremely important, and I think I think you can see a new women's movement emerging, but I think it is emerging. I don't think it's organised. There's obviously been organised responses to a lot of things that are happening, and there are obviously very active women's groups and political women's groups doing lots of amazing things. In terms of something wider and more coalesced, I think you can start to see some of these things coming together in the anti-Trump campaigns, maybe. But yeah, I think there's a lot of scope and a lot of space, and I think there's a lot of will for it. Every time you see people fighting back, but there's so much support. But I think now it's going to be so connected to just all of the kind of wider attacks. I think it's no coincidence that if you look back at the big social movements of the last, at least 20 years, women have very much been in the leadership. Stop the War campaign, very, very young women. That's where I got involved politically. But I know that that's not an exception, that was something that galvanised a lot of young women. And again, young women who've been written off and told that, they were too submissive to speak out. Involved a lot of Muslim women, defying all kinds of racist expectations. And I think as well with the anti-austerity movement, I think so much of that's been led and organised by women, campaigns against hospital closures and all of these sorts of things, and also campaigns in workplaces and lecturer strike at the moment. And so I think the signs are very hopeful.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I've got 2 daughters who Well, she's 21, the other's 18, and they're not particularly interested in politics. I hope they will. I mean, one's a nurse.
Right.
I couldn't get her to come on the NHS demo when she lives in Oxford. She wasn't a million miles from London. But
Yeah, but it's kind of like Osman's holiday.
so
You never know then, you never know.
no, I don't know, but hopefully that there'll be some leaders come through the political system just focused on particular issues. I mean, there are plenty of strong women around in Labour Party, but hopefully they'll get into Parliament and they'll start changing.
Yeah, but I also think that leaders are thrown up sort of, can be thrown up anyway, yeah, you know, and it's often the person who will speak out at work, or, you know, it's that courage just to say no, and I you know, or to start organising, and we can all be that, I think, and we can all do that, and it's important that we do. I was asked a question as well about Brett. Yes, that was the question. Yeah, about how broad was it? Yeah. Oh, I have to quantify things again. The suffragist movement was very, very extensive. It had branches all the way around the country. Because I can't do numbers. I can't actually remember. And I don't know how many members they have, but a huge number. I mean, how many?
Thousands.
Thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. The NUWSS was
Yeah, it was enormous, wasn't it? It had branches absolutely everywhere. The suffragettes were smaller, although actually at a branch level, I think people sort of picked and chose what they did, and they didn't necessarily define them in the ways that we would define them now. We know that over 1,000 women went to prison, and the activity seemed to have been, I mean, obviously, like everything, it varied according to region. You know, sometimes the local organiser would get tired, and then like the energy would sap, you know, in different, you know, or then just how things are now. Like sometimes everybody feels really up and enthusiastic, other times people feel that. So obviously there were those kind of variations. But yeah, we know that. I mean, certainly I was looking into the minute book of the first militant suffrage branch in London, who were originally called the Unemployed Women of South West Ham, which is interesting in itself. And they were getting like 80 to 90 people to their weekly meetings in 1906. So this is, yeah, it was something that potentially could, in terms of the mass meetings they held, nobody could compete with the suffragettes. You know, packed out the Albert Hall. At every hall they built, the Caxton Hall, they'd have weekly at-homes, and they'd pack it out. The Queen's Hall, same thing. Huge demonstrations. So, yeah, they were very broad. They were the militant suffragettes were the best finance campaign in Edwardian Britain. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. But yeah, obviously.
We've got a couple of questions. I know you've got a question. You've got a question. So let me just check as well. We've got, yeah, it's we're okay. I think it's yeah. Okay.
What are the kind of ideas swirling around the kind of current feminist movement? Because right now, the only one that's kind of in the media is the entire thing around Labour and whether the women's only shortlist should be open to transvestites. But obviously there's going to be others, and it's, yeah.
You know what you were saying about there are more members of the suffragist movement than the suffragettes. Yeah. I was just wondering why that would have been. Like, would it be because perhaps like the suffragettes were seen as more extreme, more radical, or whatever? That's all.
Yeah. Is there any other questions? Just while we're just in this round.
I don't know if it's a question. It's more about sort of the fact that the WSPU effectively split, with Sylvia going one way and Emmeline and Christabel going the other direction. We've seen a sort of reflection of that in the women's movement all the way along, and it's kind of, I just think, you know, it seems to me that there has to be that element of class involved. I mean, I'm on Sylvia's side, I'm on. You know, when we had sort of things like the Blair Babes, where we got a massive increase in the Labour Party of Labour women. But I can remember actually attending a conference and being pushed out of the photograph. I wasn't an MP or anything like that, but because I was dressed probably pretty similar to them today. And they were all coiffed and nice Margaret Thatcher suits, really. So it's kind of like, it's what kind of women are being promoted and where those splits are really occurring. To me, it's about class.
Maybe we'll go for that for now. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what time you want to finish. I'm just going to check because you've got to get a train. I was thinking we need to maybe be, podcast we need to definitely, you need to be leaving and just think people need. Yeah.
Okay. I completely agree with you. I completely agree that and this is
My hair's off by the way.
Not there's anything wrong with preferred hair, but the point you're making, I think, is so important because, and this is where I really object to the kind of just the focus on the glass ceiling or Theresa May being like, oh, isn't it great that we've got like a woman head of the police? Well, that's not it. It's like this, and this sort of it's individualistic and it doesn't focus on the experience of the vast majority of women. And worse than that, I think, from people like Theresa May, it implies that everybody who isn't like running a CEO and a woman isn't doing that because they're a bit of a failure and they didn't like lean in enough or whatever. And I think it's pretty poisonous, and I don't think it speaks to most of our concerns. If that's what it was about, if it was just to get a few individual women in places of power without challenging those structures of power, I mean, all this sort of focus on like who's in the boardroom, like, okay, it's not good to have a society where the top of society is, completely dominated by white males, although white rich males, although obviously it still is. But if that's just the focus and there's no question about like, well, who comes and cleans that boardroom, and like, what are they paid, and are they like, you know they're going to be majority female, you know they're going to be majority from ethnic minority backgrounds, like, then that's a women's movement that is really just for a very small minority of women. I mean, I completely agree, and I think that kind of speaks to your question about like, what are the, I think there are real issues out there that a women's movement today needs to be tackling. And I think, low pay is an absolute disgrace. The fact low pay in general is a disgrace, but then also when you break it down, the lowest 10 paid occupations are the occupations that are in the majority done by women. And surprise, surprise, they very often correlate to the kind of work that women do for free in the home, like cleaning and caring, things that are immensely valuable to our society, but because we are generally expected to do that in the home, then that is something that is completely devalued.
Is that around the living wage campaign and those kinds of?
Yeah, I think the living wage campaign is a part of that, but I think there needs to be a huge assault on poverty in this country and the whole way this country is organised and structured. I think that's a very important part of it, but there needs to, I think, to be a fundamental questioning of what we value in society, or not what I think we probably agree on that, what things are valuable in this room, but the way that society is organised and structured at the moment, you can just see is absolutely inhuman. And I'm thinking very much back to the events of last year on where the turning of property into a super commodity has got us. I think really we need to start questioning the whole way that things are organised. Why is it that everything is organised around profit? Because a society that's organised in that way relies upon the greater kind of discrimination and oppression of women. It's a very, very useful tool. I think there are very many things that we still have to fight for. But I think so many of those issues are connected to, as you were saying, these questions of class and about economic power and power in general.
does that imply you're a Marxist feminist, or does it imply those are questions that haven't been answered yet?
Both, I think. I mean, yeah, I'm definitely a Marxist, and yeah, so that's true. But I think also we haven't solved these problems. I mean, manifestly not. And in some ways, I think a lot of this stuff is getting worse. And certainly, I think the oppression of women in some ways, like although we've won a lot of, and I don't want to in any way diminish all of the gains that have been won and fought for so hard, I think you can also see things going backwards in so many ways. We've got to ask, okay, well, why is that? If it's not just about changing the law, or just about getting somebody elected, or just about getting somebody on the board, then it's got to be something social. It's got to be something that is connected to the organisation of society, and that is why I began with Marx's quote on the state. I think it's useful to understand these power structures in those terms. And then there was a final question about suffragists and why their organisation was bigger. I think it's a good question. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One was it was an older organisation, so it had longer to develop. I think part of it is to do with it being non-militant, definitely, but I think in different ways to maybe the way the media always tells us, which is that most people are horrified. I mean, I think for a lot of working class women in particular, going to prison wasn't really an option. Like, working class women did go to prison, but this was something that was difficult, and often had a much harder impact on their lives and on their kind of material existence. Also, I mean, I think the kind of growing elitism of the suffragettes, who knows where things would have gone if they hadn't become more elitist, but the suffragettes, most of them, not Sylvia, but we need to obviously remember Sylvia's own organisation really was only free after 1914, so it gets a few months really. But really, the Women's Social and Political Union was focusing on a very small number of women and getting elite women to do all the campaigning, and that was their priority. They literally explicitly stopped organising with working class women, and so they were basically saying to most women, "You're not welcome." And at the same time, the suffragists start to change their emphasis, and they start to make links with the Labour Party, and particularly in this part of the country as well. They begin to run a big campaign around the cotton mills, so kind of doing what the early suffragettes had done in some ways, and militancy changes its nature. But yeah, I think as soon as an appeal was made to the vast majority of women to come on board, we can see that kind of paying dividends. But it's an interesting question. It's obviously different in different areas.
Okay, so it's 8:30, not quite sure how long you want to go on, but are you okay if we see some more
Absolutely.
questions?
If people have got more things they want to ask, then absolutely, or say, or...
Have we got any other maybe comments or any questions that's generated? Because you've given us a lot of interesting information. So is there anything else, or is that not okay now?
Following on from your question and your answer, thanks, Sorry, start reading a little bit about unionism in the same era of the suffragettes and suffragists. What it became apparent to me here was not in Britain, I mean, but not unlike any other country, that quite a lot of the first union leaders were very middle class, educated men who actually led the campaign of raising awareness amongst the classes. Indeed, we know our most valued leaders, Marx and Engels, were very high in upper class. But actually reading about the union leaders being middle class, that came as a surprise to me. Surely that's one question for me in my head. And the second one is the fact of that First World War historic moment where even the unions took the side to go for war. Most of the unions were pro-war, like Emily and Christabel went. And I'm thinking there must have been something during that historic moment that people so mistakenly sided with war, an imperialist war nonetheless. But then you have the Second World War, which was a just war against fascism, for example, and the resistance in working class kids as well. And I just wanted to take your view about this two sort of oxymoron, if you like.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I tried to do a bit of this at the beginning of my talk, but that's okay. But no, I mean, I think what you're saying is really, really important. This is a big problem across Europe. The fact that almost every social democratic party supports the First World War, supports their own national government, the trade union leadership, the women's movement. I mean, like the suffragists had an international women's suffrage alliance. They had, contacts all the way across Europe, and then they endorsed their own states. Again, the same with the Labour Party and the trade union leaders had, they were part of the Second International. They had pledged that if war broke out, they were going to call a general strike. They had a demonstration on the 2nd of August saying they were going to do it. The 4th of August is off the table, it's gone. So I think, this is extremely important, and I think it comes down to the fact that they really felt there was something superior about their own states. They really felt that the state could be changed from within, but I think also a part of that was a belief that their own state was a bit superior to the one over there. And this is a time when Britain is presiding over the biggest empire in the world. This is not, but there were big flaws in the union movement in terms of its kind of it was not anti-imperialist, and that anti-imperialist consciousness that starts to really get fought for. There's just a few people doing it at the start of the First World War. People like Connelly saying the main enemy is at home. You've got to confront your own government. This is your task. Otherwise, you're just adding to the pro-war voices. So I think that's a big part of it, and I think it is about class and it isn't. I guess you're so right. Like so much of the leadership was middle class of these organisations. And it depends on your politics. So if there wasn't the will to, Sylvia Pankhurst came from a middle class background, but she understood the women's movement had to be led by working class women for it to be democratic and for working women not to be excluded. But if you're middle class and you don't have that view, and you think, oh yes, I should lead, this I think also causes you problems. And I think the comparison with the Second World War is really interesting. And I guess one of the major differences is what happens in the 1930s and the government's real, very obvious desire to appease fascist regimes. Winston Churchill said that if he was an Italian, he would have voted for Benito Mussolini. It's probably not in the new Churchill film. This is somebody who really thought that Benito Mussolini was very useful because he was going to crush the left in Italy. The British government was openly appeasing Hitler throughout the 1930s, and in opposition to that, it's created a huge movement in aiding Spain. Very much against the British government. People went out to fight in Spain, defying this government's declaration of neutrality, which obviously meant that the well-armed fascists won. And this brings us back to our Sylvia Pankhurst, which I guess is a nice place to end, and why I think she's so important. This is somebody who, all of her life, had an understanding of democracy that was a very far-reaching understanding of democracy, that it it had to be claimed, it wasn't something that could be given to you, and that democracy also is incompatible with poverty, with war, and with empire. And so this is someone who, she was one of the first people to identify the dangers of the rise of fascism, one of the first people to start denouncing what was happening in Italy. And this is why Ethiopia becomes the final cause of her life. This is somebody who in 1935 when fascist Italy invades Ethiopia, and none of the leaders of the countries in Europe care at all, because this looks like good old colonialism that they've been involved with. This is somebody who campaigns then for freedom of Ethiopia, first from fascist Italy and then from British imperialism for all of the rest of her life. And I think that tradition of fighting for democracy, which has to be done all the time, you know, against the British government, is, you know, it's her legacy that we should be inspired by, and it's yeah, it's not the legacy that Theresa May wanted to outline of getting some women in the boardroom. It's a legacy of always campaigning and of making those links between struggles.
Kate's got a bit of time. If anybody is interested in a Rand book, I've got that recently. I've not read it yet, but I will be. It looks really good.
I've read it.